Welcome to this journey through one of the most devastating and mysterious tragedies in Appalachian history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will move you in a way few other accounts can. A tale of betrayal, contamination, and an entire community erased in the span of 70 hours. We're about to delve into a mystery that claimed 43 lives in the remote mountains of eastern Kentucky, where a thriving coal mining village defied all odds during the harshest economic collapse America had ever seen, only to leave behind nothing but abandoned homes, unmarked graves, and a legacy so disturbing that regional historians deliberately omitted it from official county records for nearly 6 decades. It was the year 1929. The stock market had just crashed in October, sending shockwaves through every corner of American society, from Wall Street boardrooms to rural farmsteads. But in the hollows of Pike County, Kentucky, nestled between mist-shrouded ridges where the Appalachian Mountains rose like ancient sentinels, the situation was paradoxically different. While cities descended into breadlines and desperation, the small mining settlement of Thornwell Hollow was experiencing something resembling prosperity. Coal was still king in these mountains. The seams ran deep and rich through the limestone bedrock, and the Consolidated Mining Company had established operations here in 1923, bringing jobs, money, and hope to a region that had known mostly subsistence, farming, and isolation. By the autumn of 1929, Thornwell Hollow boasted a population of 67 souls, miners and their families, a company store, a one-room schoolhouse, and a small church where Reverend Isaiah Blackburn delivered sermons every Sunday morning. The settlement clung to the mountainside like a barnacle to a ship's hull, connected to the outside world by a single winding road that became impassable during heavy rains. Houses were simple wooden structures with tin roofs that drummed during mountain storms, built in ascending tiers along the slope, each one overlooking the hollow below where Thornwell Creek ran clear and cold over smooth stones worn by centuries of water flow. But the true heart of Thornwell Hollow wasn't the mine entrance or the company store or even the church. It was the well. Situated at the lowest point of the settlement, where the hollow widened into something resembling a small valley, the community well had been dug by the first settlers in 1878. It was a magnificent construction for its time, hand-excavated through 50 feet of earth and rock, lined with carefully fitted stones, and capped with a wooden structure that protected it from debris and animals. The water that rose from its depths was legendary in Pike County, cold as winter ice even in August, clear as glass, tasting faintly of minerals that some claimed had medicinal properties. Every family in Thornwell Hollow drew their water from this well. It was the gathering place, the social center, where women met in the mornings with their buckets and men paused on their way to the mine entrance just before dawn. Children played around it in the evenings, their laughter echoing off the surrounding ridges. No one could have imagined that this source of life would become an instrument of death. To understand what happened in Thornwell Hollow requires understanding the world these people inhabited, a world that existed at the intersection of old and new, tradition and industry, isolation and connection. The mountains of eastern Kentucky in 1929 were a place of contradictions. Telegraph lines now connected some of the larger towns to the outside world, but vast stretches remained as remote as they had been a century earlier. Model T Fords navigated the same trails that had once known only mule teams. Miners descended into mechanized operations during the day, then returned to homes lit by kerosene lamps and heated by wood stoves. The people of Thornwell Hollow were a tight-knit community, bound by shared labor, shared hardship, and shared faith. Most families had roots in the region going back generations, descendants of Irish settlers who had pushed into these mountains in the late 1700s, seeking land and independence. They spoke with the distinctive cadence of Appalachian English, preserving words and pronunciations that had vanished from other parts of America. They knew which plants in the forest could heal and which could kill, which signs in nature predicted weather changes, which stories from their grandparents contained warnings worth heeding. The mine itself was both blessing and curse. It provided cash income in a region where barter had been the primary economy for generations. Miners earned $3.50 per day good wages for the time and place. But coal mining in 1929 was brutal, dangerous work. The Thornwell Hollow mine had relatively modern equipment compared to some operations, but that didn't prevent VINs, gas explosions, or the slow suffocation of black lung disease that claimed men in their 40s who should have had decades left. Despite these hardships, there was genuine community here. The schoolteacher, Margaret Dennison, had arrived from Lexington 2 years earlier, bringing with her books and ambitions to educate mountain children beyond basic literacy. She boarded with the Carmichael family and had grown to love the place despite its remoteness. Reverend Blackburn, a widower in his 50s, had ministered to the settlement for nearly a decade, presiding over births, marriages, and far too many mining accident funerals. The company store was run by Samuel Worthington, who had moved from Pennsylvania when the mine opened. He kept meticulous records, extended credit cautiously, and had earned a reputation for fairness in a system that often exploited workers. His wife, Eleanor, organized the settlement's social events, harvest suppers, Christmas gatherings, quilting circles for the women. Among the mining families, certain names dominated: the Mullins clan, with 3 brothers all working underground; the Hatchers, whose grandfather had been one of the first settlers in the hollow; the Combs family, relative newcomers who had arrived just 5 years prior; the Johnsons, the Ratliffs, the Griffins, all interconnected through marriage, godparentage, and the daily intimacy of small community life. And then there was Silas Caudill. Silas was the mine foreman, 38 years old, a man who had started as a common laborer at age 14 and risen through a combination of natural intelligence, physical strength, and ruthless efficiency. He was respected but not loved, feared but not hated. Silas made the hard decisions about work assignments, safety protocols, and most importantly, who got hired and who got fired. He lived alone in a slightly larger house near the mine entrance, a privilege of his position. His wife had died in childbirth 7 years earlier, taking their infant son with her, and Silas had never remarried. Some said the loss had hardened him. Others whispered that he had always been hard, that the coldness in his gray eyes predated any personal tragedy. In the late autumn of 1929, as leaves turned spectacular shades of gold and crimson across the mountainsides, Thornwell Hollow seemed to exist in a bubble of stability while the outside world crumbled. The mine was operating at full capacity. Children attended school regularly. Sunday services were well attended. The well continued to provide its crystalline water, bucket after bucket, day after day. No one noticed the subtle changes at first. It began on a Tuesday morning, November 5, 1929. Mary Hatcher, a woman of 42, with 6 children ranging from age 4 to 17, woke before dawn, as always, to prepare breakfast for her husband William before his shift. She lit the stove, set coffee to boil, and began mixing biscuit dough. But as she worked, she noticed something odd. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she felt unusually fatigued despite having slept through the night. She attributed it to the changing season, perhaps the beginning of a cold. Mountain autumns brought illness as reliably as they brought frost. By mid-morning, 3 other women in the settlement reported similar symptoms: unusual tiredness, slight tremors, a vague sense of unwellness that was difficult to articulate. Nothing severe enough to cause real alarm, but noticeable enough to mention when they gathered at the well. "I feel like I haven't slept in days," Sarah Mullins told Eleanor Worthington as they drew water, "but I was in bed a full 8 hours. Something's going around," Eleanor replied. "My husband mentioned several men seemed off this morning at the mine, moving slower than usual. By Wednesday evening, the situation had escalated. Nearly half the settlement was experiencing symptoms now. The tremors had worsened for those initially affected. New complaints emerged: severe headaches, nausea, a metallic taste in the mouth that wouldn't go away. Several children stayed home from school, too listless to make the walk. Thursday morning brought the first truly frightening development. William Hatcher collapsed in the mine tunnel shortly after starting his shift. His brother James was working nearby and heard him cry out, a sound of shock and pain before crumpling to the damp floor. When James reached him, William was convulsing, his body rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly that James couldn't pry his mouth open. They carried him out into daylight. By the time they reached his home, the convulsions had stopped, but William was barely conscious, mumbling incoherently, his pupils dilated so widely that his eyes looked black. Mary Hatcher sat beside her husband's bed, gripping his hand, feeling her own tremors worsen as terror competed with illness. She had sent their oldest boy to fetch Granny Hale, the settlement's traditional healer, a woman in her 80s who knew herbs and remedies passed down through generations. But Granny Hale was also sick. When the boy reached her small cabin at the edge of the settlement, he found her sitting on her porch, unable to stand without dizziness overwhelming her. She gave him a pouch of dried herbs, feverfew, and willow bark, and instructions for a tea, but her hands shook so badly she could barely tie the pouch closed. "Something's wrong," she told the boy, her voice thin and frightened. "This isn't natural. This isn't any sickness I know." By Thursday afternoon, the pattern was undeniable. Nearly every person in Thornwell Hollow was exhibiting symptoms. The severity varied. Some still functioned relatively normally, while others were bedridden. But the trajectory was clear. Everyone was getting worse. Silas Caudle, interestingly, seemed less affected than most. He experienced mild tremors and fatigue, but nothing approaching the severity seen in others. He made the decision to suspend mine operations, too dangerous to work underground when men might collapse without warning, and organized a settlement meeting at the church for that evening. The church was full despite the widespread illness. Families huddled together on wooden pews, their faces drawn with fear and confusion. Lantern light cast flickering shadows on the walls. Outside, the November wind had picked up, rattling the windows and moaning through the eaves like something alive. Reverend Blackburn tried to open with a prayer, but his voice cracked, and he had to stop, gripping the pulpit for support. His hands trembled visibly. Silas stood and addressed the gathering. "We need to figure out what's happening. Everyone here is sick or getting sick. We need to think about what we all have in common. The mine," someone suggested. "Could be gas, carbon monoxide." Silas shook his head. "Women and children are just as sick as the miners, and we haven't been in the mine since yesterday morning for most of us." "Could be the food at the company store," another voice offered. "Contaminated supplies." Samuel Worthington stood, offended. "My family eats the same food I sell. My wife is as sick as anyone here." The discussion continued, frantic and circular. Every theory was examined and rejected. Influenza, but influenza didn't cause these specific symptoms. Spoiled food, but different families ate different meals. Something in the air, but why wasn't anyone from neighboring settlements affected? It was Margaret Dennison, the schoolteacher, who finally voiced what several others had begun to suspect, but were afraid to say aloud. "The well," she said, her voice barely audible above the murmuring crowd. "We all drink from the well." Silence descended like a physical weight. "That's impossible," Samuel Worthington said. "That well has served this hollow for 50 years. The water is pure." "When did symptoms start?" Margaret pressed. She was thinking like a teacher now, logical and methodical despite the pounding headache that made her skull feel like it might crack. Monday night or Tuesday morning for most people. What if something got into the well Monday? The conversation exploded. People talking over each other, some dismissive, others considering the possibility. But beneath the debate was a current of deeper fear, because if the well was contaminated, then they had all been drinking poison for nearly 4 days. And if the well was poisoned, the next question was even more terrifying: by accident or by design? Friday morning, November 8th, dawned gray and cold. Frost covered the ground, making everything brittle and somehow more ominous. The situation in Thornwell Hollow had deteriorated overnight. 2 people, old Thomas Griffin and his wife Martha, had died during the night. Their daughter found them in their bed, lying side by side, their faces peaceful despite the horror of their deaths. Both had experienced increasingly severe convulsions before slipping into unconsciousness and finally, mercifully, death. The settlement was gripped by panic now. The realization that people were actually dying transformed vague illness into mortal terror. Silas Caudle, despite his own symptoms worsening, the tremors now constant, his vision occasionally blurring, organized a group to examine the well. 6 men, those still strong enough to help, gathered at the wooden structure just after sunrise. The well cap was removed carefully. One of the men, Jacob Combs, held a lantern and leaned over the opening. The shaft descended into darkness, the stone walls disappearing into depths where light couldn't reach. The rope that held the bucket coiled beside the opening, wet with recent use. "Lower me down," Jacob said. "I'm the smallest. I can see if there's anything obvious." They rigged a harness from mining rope, tested it twice, and began lowering Jacob into the well. The rope played out slowly, 10 feet, 20, 30. Jacob called up descriptions as he descended. "Stonework looks solid. No obvious cracks or breaks. Water's still clear from what I can see." At 40 feet, he reached the water's surface. The well was deep. The water table here was reliable, but far down. Jacob held the lantern close, examining the dark surface. Then he went still. "Pull me up," he said, his voice tight. "Pull me up now." They hauled him to the surface quickly, and when Jacob's face emerged from the darkness, it was ashen. He scrambled over the lip of the well and sat heavily on the ground, breathing hard. "There's something down there," he said. At the bottom, I couldn't see it clearly, but it looked like a bundle, cloth wrapped around something, tied with rope. The men exchanged glances. Horror and understanding rippled through the group. "We need to get it out," Silas said. "Whatever it is, we need to see it." Using the well bucket and grappling hooks fashioned from bent nails, they began the painstaking process of retrieving whatever lay at the bottom. It took nearly an hour, multiple attempts, the hook catching and slipping, catching and holding. Finally, they felt solid weight on the rope. They pulled carefully. The weight was significant, waterlogged, resistant. Inch by inch, hand over hand, they raised it through 40 feet of darkness and cold stone. When it finally emerged into daylight, dripping and reeking of stagnant water, and something else, something chemical and wrong. They laid it on the ground beside the well. It was indeed a bundle, wrapped in what had once been a canvas tarp, tied with rope at both ends. The fabric was partially deteriorated from time in the water, pieces sloughing off to reveal what lay beneath. Silas cut the rope with his pocket knife. His hands were shaking badly now. Whether from illness or dread, it was impossible to say. Inside the canvas were 4 glass jars, the kind used for canning. Each jar had once been sealed with a metal lid, but time and water had corroded the seals. 3 of the jars were shattered, their contents long since leaked into the well water. The 4th remained intact. And on this 4th jar, barely legible but unmistakable, was a label written in faded pencil: arsenious oxide, arsenic. The word hung in the cold morning air like the blade of a guillotine. God in heaven, Reverend Blackburn whispered. He had joined the group at the well, and now he staggered backward, his face a mask of horror. We've been drinking arsenic. But the discovery raised as many questions as it answered. How long had this bundle been in the well? Days, weeks, and more pressingly, more terrifyingly, who had put it there? By Friday afternoon, Thornwell Hollow was experiencing something that could only be described as a mass casualty event. The arsenic poisoning had progressed through its deadly stages. What had begun as tremors and fatigue had advanced to severe gastrointestinal distress, intense pain, convulsions, and for the most severely affected, multi-organ failure. The settlement's small church had been converted into a makeshift hospital, pews pushed aside to make room for pallets where the sick lay in rows. Margaret Dennison, despite her own illness, moved among them with water boiled first, brought from Thornwell Creek, anything but the poisoned well, trying to provide comfort. But she was a schoolteacher, not a nurse, and the scope of suffering exceeded anything she could meaningfully address. Children cried for parents who couldn't respond. Men who had descended into mine shafts without fear now whimpered in agony as their bodies betrayed them. Women who had birthed babies and buried loved ones with stoic mountain strength now screamed as cramps seized their muscles hard enough to break bones. Someone had to get help. This was beyond anything the settlement could handle on its own. Silas Caudill made the decision. He would take the settlement's one automobile, a truck belonging to the mining company, and drive to Pikeville, the county seat, some 40 miles away over treacherous mountain roads. He would bring back a doctor, medicine, help. He left Friday at noon. The truck's engine coughed and rattled as it climbed out of the hollow, leaving behind a community descending into hell. What Silas didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that his relative immunity to the arsenic wasn't luck or constitution. It was exposure, because Silas Caudill was the one who had poisoned the well. Back in Thornwell Hollow, people continued dying. By Friday evening, the death count had risen to 7. By Saturday morning, it reached 15. The church couldn't hold them all anymore. Bodies were laid out in people's homes, covered with sheets, waiting for burial that no one had the strength to perform. Reverend Blackburn, rallying what remained of his strength, moved among the dying with prayers and blessings. He had long since accepted that he too was dying. His tremors were severe now, his vision fading in and out. But he had a duty to these people, his flock, and he would fulfill it until he couldn't draw breath. Why? Someone asked him, a miner named Paul Ratliff, who lay on a pallet with his wife and 2 children nearby, all of them sick. Why would God allow this? Blackburn had no answer. For the first time in his ministerial career, he had no words of comfort, no theological framework that could make sense of this. An entire community, poisoned through their most basic necessity. Life itself turned into death through the water that was supposed to sustain them. "I don't know," he said honestly, "I don't know." Meanwhile, Silas Caudill was making slow progress toward Pikeville. The mountain roads were barely roads at all in places, more like suggestions of paths carved through wilderness. His truck navigated switchbacks where one wrong turn meant plunging hundreds of feet down rocky slopes. And his condition was worsening. The tremors made it hard to grip the steering wheel. Twice he had to stop and vomit by the roadside, his body finally rebelling against the poison he had somehow thought wouldn't affect him as severely. Because that had been his calculation. Silas had been consuming small doses of arsenic for months, building tolerance, a practice he'd read about in a book from the company store about historical poisonings. He thought it would protect him when he contaminated the well. He thought he could survive while others died. Why had Silas Caudill decided to murder his entire community? The answer lay in a stack of papers locked in his desk, drawer back in Thornwell Hollow. Documents that detailed the mine's true financial situation. The Consolidated Mining Company was failing, had been failing for over a year. The coal seam was playing out sooner than projected. The company was preparing to close the mine, abandon the settlement, leave these people with nothing. But there was insurance. Significant insurance policies on the mining operation, policies that paid out generously in cases of disaster. And there was something else. Silas had been speculating on the stock market with embezzled mining company funds. When the crash came in October, he had lost everything, not just his own savings, but thousands of dollars that belonged to the company, money that would soon be audited and discovered. Silas needed a disaster, something catastrophic enough to destroy records, create chaos, provide cover for his theft. Something that would make him a victim rather than a criminal. Mass poisoning, written off as a tragic accident, would serve perfectly. What he hadn't fully understood was the nature of arsenic, the cumulative effect, the way it would affect him despite his tolerance efforts. The sheer horror of watching an entire community die over days of agony. Saturday afternoon, Silas's truck broke down 15 miles from Pikeville. The engine simply died, steam rising from under the hood, and no amount of tinkering would revive it. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, trembling hands resting on useless steering apparatus, and began to laugh. The laughter turned to sobbing, then to silence. He would have to walk the remaining distance. In his condition, it might take all night. And even when he arrived, even when he brought help, it would be too late for most of them, maybe all of them, maybe even himself. Help arrived in Thornwell Hollow on Sunday afternoon, November 10, 1929. A convoy of vehicles struggled up the mountain road. 3 doctors from Pikeville, the county sheriff and 2 deputies, nurses from the county hospital, and a reporter from the Pikeville Daily Tribune who had heard rumors of a catastrophe and insisted on accompanying them. What they found exceeded their worst imaginings. The settlement was silent except for the wind, no children playing, no smoke from chimneys, the usual sounds of community life, voices, laughter, work. Absent completely, they found the first bodies in the church, 17 people arranged in rows, some covered with blankets, others exposed to the cold air. The doctors began examining them immediately, taking notes, collecting samples. The cause of death was obvious to anyone with medical training: acute arsenic poisoning. But the scale was unprecedented. Dr. William Hammond, the lead physician, had never seen anything like it. Individual poisonings, yes, even poisonings of entire families, but an entire settlement. They found survivors in several homes. 24 people still alive, though most were in critical condition. The doctors worked frantically, administering what limited treatment existed for arsenic poisoning. Dimercaprol injections when available, activated charcoal, intravenous fluids, supportive care. Sheriff Thomas Kincaid was a practical man, weathered by years of dealing with mountain justice, moonshine operations, and family feuds. But this shook him to his core. He stood in the center of the hollow, slowly turning in a circle, taking in the abandoned houses, the empty schoolyard, the terrible stillness. Who would do this? He asked Dr. Hammond, and why? Maybe no one. Hammond replied, wiping his hands on a cloth after examining another body. Could have been an accident, mining chemicals somehow contaminating the water supply. But Hammond didn't believe it even as he said it. The broken jars recovered from the well told a different story. Someone had deliberately placed them there. Silas Caudill arrived late Sunday evening, brought in a sheriff's vehicle after he was found collapsed on the road to Pikeville. He was immediately given medical treatment, his condition assessed as serious but survivable with proper care. The reporter, Jonathan Webb, began interviewing survivors who could speak. He talked to Margaret Dennison, who had somehow maintained relative stability despite being poisoned. He spoke with Reverend Blackburn, who was dying but coherent enough to give testimony about the settlement's final days. And he talked to young Timothy Mullins, age 12, whose entire family, mother, father, 3 brothers, had all died. Timothy lay on a pallet in what used to be the schoolhouse, his voice thin and small. "I saw Mr. Caudill at the well," Timothy said. "Monday night, late. I was coming back from checking traps with my pa, and I saw Mr. Caudill by the well with something heavy. He was lowering something down with rope." Webb's pencil stopped moving across his notebook. "You're certain it was Monday night, before people got sick?" Timothy nodded. "Told my pa, but he said I must have been mistaken," said Mr. Caudill wouldn't have any reason to be at the well that late. Webb looked across the room to where Silas Caudill was receiving medical care. The mine foreman's eyes were closed, but his jaw was clenched, and tears were running down his face. Sheriff Kincaid was called over. The boy repeated his testimony. Other pieces began falling into place. Silas's lighter symptoms compared to others who had drunk the same amount of water. His sudden decision to drive for help. Fleeing the scene, perhaps. The reporter's investigation into Consolidated Mining Company records would later reveal the embezzlement, the insurance policies, the financial desperation. But the full accounting would take weeks. For now, in the immediate aftermath of November 10th, the priority was simply survival. By Monday morning, 3 more people had died, bringing the total to 20. Of the original 60, 7 residents of Thornwell Hollow, only 24 would survive, and several of them would live with permanent health effects from the arsenic exposure. Neurological damage, kidney failure, blindness. Silas Caudill survived. His self-administered tolerance protocol and lighter exposure. He had been drinking from a private spring near his house for several days while publicly using the well. Gave him better odds than most. When he was stable enough to be questioned, Sheriff Kincaid sat beside his hospital bed in Pikeville. The conversation was recorded in the sheriff's case notes, preserved in the Pike County archives. "Why?" Kincaid asked simply. Silas was silent for a long time. "Then I was trying to save myself. The mine was closing. I had debts. I thought if there was a disaster, I could start over somewhere else. I thought it would be quick, painless. I didn't understand what arsenic really did. You murdered 43 people. No." Silas's voice was hoarse, broken. "I didn't think it through. I thought maybe a few would get sick, enough to make it look like an accident. I didn't think the water table would pull the poison through so fast. I didn't think Everyone would drink so much before anyone realized. But you put the arsenic in the well. Yes. You deliberately poisoned the water supply of your entire community. Yes. The trial of Silas Caudle began in March of 1930. It was one of the shortest murder trials in Kentucky history. The evidence was overwhelming. Timothy Mullins's eyewitness testimony, the arsenic jars traced to a shipment Silas had ordered through the mining company for rodent control, the financial records showing his embezzlement and desperation, and his own confession. The defense attorney, appointed by the court since Silas couldn't afford one, argued temporary insanity brought on by financial stress and grief from his earlier family losses. The jury deliberated for 47 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty on 43 counts of murder in the first degree. The judge, William Harmon, read the sentence in a courtroom packed with survivors and relatives of the dead. His voice trembled with restrained emotion. You have perpetrated an act of such profound evil that it defies comprehension. You poisoned the very source of life for people who trusted you, worked beside you, considered you a leader. This, the law allows only one sentence: death by hanging. Silas Caudle was executed on June 13, 1930, at the Kentucky State Penitentiary in Eddyville. Reverend Blackburn, who had survived the poisoning but would die 6 months later from kidney failure caused by arsenic damage, visited Silas 2 days before the execution. Their conversation was private, but Blackburn later told a reporter that Silas spent the entire visit weeping and begging forgiveness, not from the law or even from God, but from the ghosts of Thornwell Hollow. At the execution, Silas's final words were simply, "I'm sorry. God help me, I'm so sorry." The trapdoor opened. Justice, such as it was served. Thornwell Hollow was never reoccupied. After the poisoning, the survivors were relocated to other communities throughout Pike County. The mining company, facing massive legal liability and public outcry, filed for bankruptcy. The mine was sealed permanently. The houses, the church, the schoolhouse all were abandoned to the elements. The well was filled with rocks and concrete, then covered with a concrete cap 3 feet thick. A wooden marker was placed beside it, though no one knows who put it there. It reads simply, "Here lie the memories of the innocents. May they rest." Within 5 years, nature began reclaiming the settlement. Vines grew over the buildings. Roofs collapsed under the weight of snow. Windows shattered. Thornwell Hollow returned to the wilderness from which it had briefly emerged. The few survivors carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. Margaret Dennison never taught again, moving back to Lexington and living reclusively until her death in 1968. Timothy Mullins, the boy whose testimony had convicted Caudle, became an itinerant worker, never settling in one place, never forming attachments, forever haunted by the memory of his family dying in agony. But perhaps the strangest aftermath was the official response, or rather, the lack thereof. Pike County officials, concerned about the economic impact of publicizing such a horrific event during the already devastating Great Depression, made a conscious decision to minimize coverage. The story ran in the Pikeville paper, but regional and national newspapers were discouraged from picking it up. Official county histories compiled in the 1940s and 50s make no mention of Thornwell Hollow or the poisoning. The settlement was essentially erased from official memory. Maps from 1935 onward show the hollow as uninhabited forest land. The cemetery where the victims were buried, a hastily prepared mass grave site on a hillside above the settlement, was left unmarked, its location known only to a few aging survivors who would eventually take the knowledge to their own graves. It wasn't until 1992 that the story resurfaced. A graduate student at the University of Kentucky, researching coal mining disasters, stumbled across trial transcripts in archived court records. She brought the case to the attention of her professor, who recognized its significance. An article was published in the Journal of Appalachian History. Reporters began investigating. Descendants of survivors were located and interviewed. The Kentucky Historical Society authorized an archaeological survey of the site. The survey team, arriving in Thornwell Hollow in the autumn of 1993, found a place reclaimed entirely by nature. 64 years had passed since the poisoning. The buildings were rubble barely distinguishable from natural stone formations. The roads were faint depressions in the forest floor. But the well was still there, its concrete cap cracked but intact, surrounded by old-growth trees that had seeded themselves in the decades of abandonment. And they found the cemetery, 27 graves, most unmarked, a few with crude stone markers whose inscriptions had been worn away by weather. Using ground-penetrating radar and forensic techniques, they confirmed that these were indeed the victims of the 1929 poisoning. A memorial was erected in 1995, a simple stone monument near the site of the old church, bearing the names of the 43 dead and the 24 survivors. It includes this inscription, in memory of the community of Thornwell Hollow, Kentucky, established 1878, destroyed November 1929. May this place serve as a reminder that the most profound evil often arises not from hatred, but from human weakness, fear, and desperate selfishness. The story of Thornwell Hollow remains a disturbing reminder that the foundations of community, trust, shared resources, mutual dependence, can be shattered in moments by a single act of betrayal. Silas Caudill wasn't a monster born. He was a man who made calculations, who let fear override conscience, who convinced himself that his survival justified the deaths of innocents. But questions remain that haunt anyone who studies this case. How many other similar events might have occurred in isolated communities and been lost to history, deliberately forgotten or simply never recorded? What happened to the survivors' descendants? Do they carry genetic damage from the arsenic exposure? And most troublingly, what transforms an ordinary person into someone capable of mass murder? The psychological profile of Silas Caudill reveals someone not fundamentally different from many others facing similar pressures during the Great Depression. He wasn't psychotic. He wasn't driven by sadistic pleasure or ideological hatred. He was desperate, panicked, and morally bankrupt. He made a series of small decisions, embezzling money, gambling on the market, continuing to dig deeper into his lies, that eventually left him cornered with no apparent way out. The arsenic was a solution, cold, efficient, from his distorted perspective, perhaps even merciful compared to the slow starvation he imagined awaiting the community when the mine inevitably closed. But therein lies the profound horror. Caudill wasn't even correct in his calculations. The mine would have closed, yes. Families would have faced hardship, certainly, but they would have survived. They would have adapted, moved, found new work, rebuilt their lives. Instead, Caudill's solution simply accelerated their destruction in the most agonizing way imaginable. To this day, Thornwell Hollow exists only as a memory and a warning. The forest has completely consumed the settlement. If you didn't know where to look, you could walk through the area without realizing that 43 people died there, that homes once stood, that children once played, that a community once thrived. Local hiking guides mention the memorial, but it's difficult to reach. A 4-mile hike up an unmarked trail that requires crossing Thornwell Creek multiple times. Few people make the journey. The memorial stone itself has been vandalized at least twice by unknown parties who perhaps felt that some stories are better left buried. The descendants of survivors occasionally return. There's a small gathering every November 10th, the anniversary of the day help arrived, attended by anywhere from 5 to 20 people, depending on the year. They leave flowers at the memorial, share stories passed down through families, and maintain the site as best they can. One survivor's grandson, a man named Robert Hatcher, spoke to a local news crew in 2010 about what the tragedy meant to his family. His grandmother had been 8 years old when the poisoning occurred. She survived, but her parents, 2 brothers, and a sister all died. She rarely spoke about it, Robert said, but when she did, her pain was as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. She told me once, Robert recalled, his eyes distant, that the worst part wasn't the dying. It was the moment when they all realized what had happened, when they understood that someone had deliberately poisoned them. That betrayal, that realization that evil wasn't some distant concept, but something right there in their community, wearing a familiar face, that broke something in the survivors that never healed. The psychological trauma extended beyond the immediate survivors. The evacuation and resettlement fractured family networks and cultural connections that had existed for generations. Children who survived grew up scattered across different communities, disconnected from their roots, carrying a legacy of trauma they often couldn't articulate. Modern psychologists who have studied the case note that it represents a unique form of collective trauma, not a natural disaster where no one is to blame, not even a war where the enemy is external, but an internal betrayal that shattered the fundamental assumption of community safety. The story of Thornwell Hollow resonates today in ways its victims could never have anticipated. In an era of increasing concerns about water security, environmental contamination, and community resilience, the case serves as a stark reminder of how fragile our infrastructure really is. The Flint water crisis, the industrial contaminations in places like Hinckley, California, and countless other examples demonstrate that the threat of poisoned water didn't end in 1929. The mechanisms differ: government negligence, corporate malfeasance, accidental contamination. But the fundamental vulnerability remains. We still depend on shared water systems. We still must trust that those responsible for maintaining these systems will act with integrity. And when that trust is violated, communities still suffer in ways that extend far beyond physical illness. The legal ramifications of the Thornwell Hollow case also established precedents still cited today. The concept of mass murder by poisoning of essential resources created legal frameworks used in environmental crime prosecution. The case demonstrated that intent to harm even a portion of a population could result in murder charges for all deaths that resulted, a principle that has been applied in cases ranging from industrial contamination to bioterrorism attempts. In the field of toxicology, the Thornwell Hollow poisoning provided crucial data about arsenic exposure in populations. The medical records from survivors, those who were studied by physicians in the years following the event, contributed to understanding of chronic arsenic poisoning, treatment protocols, and long-term health effects. This knowledge has saved lives in subsequent cases of arsenic exposure worldwide. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is the cautionary tale itself. In psychology courses, criminology programs, and ethics seminars, Silas Caudill's case is studied as an example of how ordinary moral failings can escalate into extraordinary evil. He wasn't insane. He wasn't a serial killer acting on compulsion. He was a man who faced a problem and chose the most expedient solution without fully considering, or perhaps caring about, the human cost. The question his case poses is uncomfortable. In his position, facing his pressures, how many of us might make similar calculations? Not the same extreme action, perhaps, but the underlying logic prioritizing our own survival, our own comfort, our own escape from consequences at the expense of others. Is that not something most humans are capable of under the right circumstances? Scholars of moral philosophy point to Thornwell Hollow as a case study in the banality of evil. Hannah Arendt's concept, developed in response to the Holocaust, applies equally here. Evil doesn't require monsters. It merely requires ordinary people who fail to exercise moral courage, who compartmentalize their actions, who convince themselves that the ends justify the means. Silas Caudill knew the people he poisoned. He worked beside them. He supervised their labor. He attended church with them. Yet he still poured arsenic into their water supply. This proximity makes his crime somehow more disturbing than killings committed by strangers. It suggests that the capacity for profound evil exists not in the distance between people, but in the ability to mentally distance oneself from the humanity of victims, even when they're standing right next to you. On quiet autumn evenings, when the wind moves through the trees where Thornwell Hollow once stood, some locals claim they can still hear echoes of the settlement. Not ghosts, exactly, but something more subtle, a certain quality of silence, as if the land itself remembers what happened there. Hikers occasionally report feeling uneasy near the old well site, even those who don't know its history. The memorial stone has been found with flowers left by unknown visitors, people who stumbled across it and felt compelled to acknowledge the lives lost there. The forest has healed. The trees are tall and healthy. The creek runs clear. Deer browse through what used to be the schoolyard. Nature, at least, has moved on. But for those who know the story, the place remains haunted not by supernatural phenomena, but by questions that admit no easy answers. How do we protect ourselves from threats that come from within our own communities? How do we maintain trust in shared systems, knowing how easily that trust can be violated? How do we prevent desperate people from making catastrophic choices? The people of Thornwell Hollow did everything right. They built a community based on mutual support. They worked hard. They maintained their infrastructure. They trusted their leaders. And yet, one man's desperation was enough to destroy everything they had built. Their story reminds us that civilization is more fragile than we like to believe. The thin veneer of law, morality, and social contract can be pierced by a single act of betrayal. And when it is, the consequences ripple outward in ways that can never be fully predicted or contained. 43 people died in Thornwell Hollow. 4 survived but carried the scars forever. Countless descendants were affected by the trauma passed down through generations. One community vanished from the earth, leaving behind only ruins, memories, and a warning carved in stone. The warning is simple but profound. Trust is the foundation of community, but it must be accompanied by vigilance, accountability, and the moral courage to question authority when something seems wrong. The people of Thornwell Hollow trusted Silas Caudill because of his position, his competence, his years of service. That trust cost them everything. If this journey through one of Appalachia's darkest chapters has resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the fragility of community trust and the capacity for evil that lurks in human desperation, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your own perspectives on trust, community, and the moral choices we face when cornered by circumstance. What would you have done if you had been Timothy Mullins, a 12-year-old boy who saw something suspicious but was told he must have been mistaken? Would you have pressed harder? Would you have insisted on being heard? Or would you, like him, have deferred to adult authority, assuming they knew better? These are the questions that keep us awake at night. These are the stories that remind us history isn't just dates and names, but a vast tapestry of human choices, each one carrying weight, each one mattering more than we realize at the moment of decision. Until next time, remember that the past speaks to us not to judge those who came before, but to illuminate the choices we face now. The wells we drink from, literal and metaphorical, require our constant vigilance. Trust, but verify. Hope, but prepare. And never assume that evil requires a monster's face. It sometimes wears the face of a desperate man who thought he could save himself by destroying a community. The silence of Thornwell Hollow echoes still,